Hello, we are live on YouTube. My name is Joshua Gilliland. I am one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. Thank you for joining us for our review of episode 11 of Andor, Daughter of Ferrix. With me this evening for our legal and geek analysis is Stephen Tollefield, Christine Peake, Bethany Blanton, and Thomas Harper. We should be joined by one other when we get rolling. So everybody, starting with Steven, what did you think of this episode?
There was a lot going on that was kind of recapping a lot of things. So there wasn't a lot of forward movement, although some bombshells got communicated to some of the major characters, which were great to see. But of course, the lightsaber spaceship, probably a key moment. That was amazing. I was really excited about that.
Excellent. Christine?
Yeah, definitely. The stars for me were definitely the dogfight. I knew something was going to happen and I knew it was going to be good, but I wasn't prepared for the red lasers, which look certainly like they're lightsabers. But it was awesome, as Stephen says. The other stars for me were B, obviously, with his very human sounding emotions. And that conversation between Luthen and Saw is really interesting and intense and great acting. But there's a lot of other great details too, like when Nemik's manifesto starts playing and the old lonely abandoned beach, now that the Empire has cracked down. So a lot of things to like about this episode.
Bethany?
This episode, I felt like it was moving really quickly. One of the stars for me was just seeing the beach because of the throwback or throw forward to Rogue One. That honestly very much plucked my heartstrings, at least. So I kind of left that episode with like, oh, yeah, this is not a happily ever after story for really anyone in the show. Yeah.
Cost of freedom. Thomas?
I really enjoyed it. I sat there like on the edge of my seat thinking, as the rest of you did, Cassian really has an opposite sort of relationship with the beach than most people. Little concerned about Cassian's operational security, just going and using the payphone on the beach where he got captured not too long before. But yeah, seeing the Fondor in action, watching that built-in droid in the sort of suspense as Luthen is just sort of coldly calculating exactly what he needs to do. He's been like mentally preparing for this moment for a long time. And it was cool seeing that particular capital ship in action. It's they name it the a Cantwell class after Colin Cantwell, one of the OG designers for Star Wars. And that particular design was like a precursor to what became the Star Destroyer. So it was really nice. Cantwell died within the last year, so it was a neat little fitting tribute, although his design got messed all up.
Those are like the proper fan service, to see with honoring someone who will make it. I thought we saw that design in Rebels, but I could be wrong that they had an intelligence ship that had a bunch of dishes on it.
Yeah, you're thinking of a modified Gozanti cruiser that but spot on with the remembering that episode. This ship has been seen in live action, but only in the Imperial recruiting commercial in Solo. You see it very briefly. I have a addled condition.
That's terrifyingly impressive. So well done. I think this series is going to get Emmy nominations. So just because it is phenomenal with the writing and the storytelling and what they've put together. So very, very impressed. So, looking forward to what comes next. So let's get into our legal analysis. So out of the gate, there's a discussion about a permit to close Rix Road for Maarva's funeral. And that raises a question of when a permit can be required for such an event. Who brought that up? And I'm delighted to talk about time, place, and manner restrictions for free speech. So take it away, whoever added that to the outline.
It was me, Josh. So I added that one. I thought that conversation between Dedra and I think the other officer's name is Tio. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but so he says that, well, they're just going to deny the permit and the people of Ferrix are just going to add this to their list of grievances. And she tells him, no, you're going to grant the permit, but keep it small, limit the time, limit the numbers so that we can put them in a box and stand back and watch. And there are certain types of events that may require a permit consistent with the First Amendment. And that would include something like a march or a parade that does not stay on the sidewalk, or events that require blocking the traffic or a street closure. The government does have an interest in traffic control and safety. And so the courts, when they've considered those types of permitting schemes, though, have said that such a scheme has to meet certain constitutional requirements. So it cannot delegate overly broad discretion to the government official. And further, any permit scheme controlling the time, place, and manner of speech must not be based on the content of the message. It must be narrowly tailored to serve a significant governmental interest, and it must leave open ample alternatives for communication. So when the other officer says, oh, we're just going to deny it, under that rule, a permitting scheme that was controlling for time, place, and manner couldn't allow the government leeway to grant or deny the permit based on whether the event is controversial or whether unpopular views might be expressed. Because Maarva has been very politically active recently on Ferrix, something like her political views or her work as a daughter of Ferrix, that wouldn't be a content neutral basis for denying a permit, and neither would the abstract possibility that her funeral procession might rile up the crowd. Courts have also observed that a listener's reaction to the speech isn't a content neutral basis for regulation. So here the empire probably isn't concerned about the First Amendment implications. They realize that it is not in their own self-interest to deny the permit. But one of her other lines in that scene implicates another aspect of those constitutional requirements, specifically the narrow tailoring. So the regulation has to be narrowly tailored to serve a significant governmental interest. And she says, well, limit the time, limit the numbers. And so a lot of permit ordinances do give discretion to officials to impose conditions on an event. So for example, they may allow them to set the route, or they may impose conditions on something like the sound level of amplification equipment. And those restrictions may or may not pass First Amendment muster. They may not if they're unnecessary for whatever the government interest is. So if it's not actually necessary for traffic control or to ensure public safety, they may not pass. But here, certainly limiting the numbers, if you're closing a road, you certainly, you don't want people to be crushed, for example. And so it may make sense to limit the number of attendees. I don't know if we see anything that suggests that Dedra's limit on time is really tied to a legitimate governmental interest of the empire, but we'll see here. So they do allow the event to go forward. They do say they're going to grant the permit.
And well said on what goes into a time, place, and manner restriction, because it's not just free reign of we want to close the road. It could be a traffic jam. Now, granted, the empire doesn't have an altruistic purpose for this. There have been other podcasters who are just spinning wild, thinking that Maarva's alive and like it's some complex trap being set for the empire. It's her attendees to honor her. That doesn't make sense for a trap for Imperials. So there's there are people who are having problems letting go, I think is the
They
best.
can't make her into a brick. No.
And it's just, she looked really old and sick, like with a glow of death about her. So now the question is Cassian dumb enough to go back for that service, considering all that's going on? You think he
Well,
would?
he was dumb enough to like call back.
He was. That was also stupid. But
No names. Cassian.
Yeah, Cass.
it just like he should not have called. And if he did, like, should have been from like a different planet and then leave. Yeah. Again, something that Luthen taught him that he seems to have forgotten after his incarceration. But that brings us to how he got to the beach in the first place. And it's from running around on another beach where they decided to just take a fisherman's quad jumper. This raises the issue of attempted hijacking. That's a plane. Hijacking a plane is air piracy, which under our laws, 49 USC 46502A defines the crime as seizing or exercising control over an aircraft by force, violence, threat of force or violence, or any form of intimidation with wrongful intent. They totally planned to steal the quad jumper, just run by the fishermen and leave. Now they're stopped because there are traps, but that does not give them, you can be charged with attempt. We charge people for attempted crimes, contrary to what some people think. And that is an issue. Now, we do get the big turn, but anyone want to talk about the attempt issue with stealing a quad jumper that looks mighty familiar?
Yeah, all I could think of when we saw the quad jumper was, first of all, the Leonardo DiCaprio meme, and hearing quad jumper in Ray's adorable accents. That was all I could think about. But also, it struck me that Melshi was so impulsive to try to jump and make a run for the ship, and Cassian just kind of followed him. I would be curious about whether there was enough of an agreement there to sort of substantiate a conspiracy, but then again, Andor runs towards the quad jumper. That's a substantial step towards the completion of the crime. So even though it was a very impulsive split-second decision, that's probably enough to establish his liability too.
Yeah, who I get they've been in prison for months. They want out. They don't know what's happening. Lord knows how far they had to swim. And the idea of like, we'll just steal somebody's vehicle in order to get off this planet. It's like, we're not going to bother negotiating. We're just going to try to jump these guys and take their ship. So, but again, raises the issue of what comes next of non-lethal defense of property. So you can't use lethal force to defend property like your house. For example, you can't have a moat with alligators and a minefield in front of your home. You can't have spring guns, and you don't get to use lethal force to defend property. Our fishermen have non-lethal force set up with this net trap that shoots our protagonists. Now, California's jury instruction number 5.43 states, when conditions are present which under the law justify a person in using force in defense of property, that person may use the degree and extent of force as would appear to a reasonable person placed in the same position and seeing and knowing what the resisting person then sees and knows to be reasonably necessary to prevent immediate injury threatened to the property. Any use of force beyond that limit is excessive and unjustified, and anyone using excessive force is legally responsible for the consequences thereof. The question here is, this is a trap. So it's a net trap that hits Andor. Does the law allow that? So it's not lethal, but it's still a trap. Who wants to take issue with this?
I looked into it a little bit, and
You're muted, Stephen.
Oh, is it still muted?
No, we
Now
can
you're
hear you.
not. Now we can hear you.
Okay, great. It just a little bit of delay. I looked into it a little bit, and I came at it from a torts perspective, that the people who were injured by the non-lethal force that was triggered as a trap wouldn't be able to sue if the landowner found that it was necessary to have that trap, the use of that particular device is reasonable, and 3, as long as the trap or the device was not hidden. The point is that the law requires these sort of non-lethal things like barbed wire or spiked rails. They have to be visible so that they function as a deterrent for people to prevent them from coming on the property. The hidden traps don't function as a deterrent. They're just there to kind of hurt people. So those are not allowed. So even though these traps were kind of non-lethal and kind of funny and gross and weird in a Star Wars way, they probably would not be privilege in a way that would prevent Cassian and Melshi for suing the aliens for any injury.
And I wonder if there's a, oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask, does anyone think that the traps were hidden? Because they're visible, but you would have to know what you're looking at.
The pressure plate may or may not have been, depends on, I guess, your savviness. But I also wonder, to me, the net, it almost seemed like Mon Calamari in design, right? It was squishy and like gelatinous. I don't know. Something
like
out of
wet.
like, yeah.
It's gross.
It's like
Slimy.
classic
Yeah.
Star Wars. But it didn't seem to hurt them. But the idea, and maybe I haven't looked into this, whether foreseeability of injury as a result would be a consideration. But the idea that if you netted somebody with this pressure plate trap, that they were likely to fall over and maybe hurt themselves. So in other words, the net itself, the squishiness and stuff, that's not going to hurt you. That's not foreseeable. But you could predict reasonably that somebody could get hurt once they got netted and fell over. I don't know if that's a consideration with traps that aren't inherently dangerous or designed to injure, but it's an interesting question here.
I
Agreed.
would think that culturally they could argue that maybe that's a common defense that they have for thieves or hijackers, or maybe even if there's larger wildlife around or something that could interfere with their processes or their fishing or anything like that. So it's possible that that's something that's common for them. But of course, I mean, Cassian wouldn't know that.
Yeah. It could be, yeah, that's a great point. It could be set up to watch their backs basically while they, against wildlife while they fish.
Or wild humans.
Or wild prisoners.
I'm thinking of the anti-piracy devices that cargo ships have when transiting the Straits of Malacca, because that's where modern day pirates hit ships. And they do have high pressure water cannons. So like those, granted, they're operated, so it's not like they just turn on and wash a pirate away. But it's like pirates might be thinking, I didn't expect to get hit with a 500 PSI stream of water today. But on the flip side, you were planning an act of piracy. So how's that control? So but so again, a lot to think about.
Yeah, I think these were really fact-bound questions. I looked at CalCrim 3476, which is another set. It's just a different set of jury instructions, but it's really similar to the one that Josh read off. It basically affirms that owners can use reasonable force to protect property from imminent harm. And then I tried to see if there's any cases that applied that section of the restatement that Stephen found, but I came up empty. I didn't do a very lengthy search, but I think it just comes down to the facts, right? Like what is customary on Narkina 5? Maybe the nets are commonly used. And even if maybe you don't realize what the little box is, it did make a noise and a red light went off before it activated. So there was some kind of warning. So I feel like you could argue those things either way. Maybe it's not as open and obvious as barbed wire, but it's not exactly concealed either. My thought about that whole fact pattern was it's not really clear what Freedy intends to do with that blade that pops out. It kind of struck me that he was brandishing and maybe threatening them with deadly force. And if that is what he was doing, I questioned whether that would be justified in circumstances where Andor and Melshi are really already incapacitated in the nets. Maybe deadly force is probably not warranted. But luckily, things all work out for them.
Yeah, nobody ends up being turned into live bait for the squishies, and because they're fishermen who are upset about what's happening to their environment. But yeah, a lot to unpack there. Good analysis, everybody. Well, let's get into the issue of wills and trusts. So Maarva appears to have died. I think she's dead. Raises the issue of ownership of B. When we've never seen such devotion in a droid before. This is like full on puppy, except that the puppy's basically immortal and can be handed down as property and can outlive the owner, which is the opposite of what we humans have with dogs. It does raise the issue that to a Wookiee, we're the pet, just because of their longer lifespans. But let's take the issue of who owns the droid and who added this. I was going
to say that the first question that popped into my mind that's necessary here is, did Maarva live long enough did she have enough foresight to have an estate plan, to have a will? When we talk about estate law, what happens to your stuff when you die? The first question is, did you leave instructions? And the instructions that are recognized by law, classically, it's a will. It doesn't have to be written out with a cover sheet and all fancily bound by an attorney, but the court is going to look to your instructions that you've written down and attested to, signed to. And I don't know, it's not clear whether she would have had something like that done. I don't know statistics on this in terms of how many folks actually have an estate plan, but I don't know that Maarva planned necessarily far in advance to die, and I'm not sure if she would have had the foresight to draft a will. And if you don't have a will, there's a whole set of default rules called intestacy that kicks in, that functions to distribute your property in sort of a default manner.
Yes, intestate succession varies state by state, even though it's generally flows downhill. But with her son gone, that raises the question, does she have any other relatives that things could go to, or would all of her property go to the state? A lot of folks get very uncomfortable with the idea of writing a will. I just talked with my brother about friends of his who need to draft a will because the guy's having surgery and doesn't want to. So there are people who just the idea of death frightens them so much they don't want to plan for it. And that's really ugly to everyone you love, because it leaves a mess for them to deal with on who is supposed to get what, or how, if you wanted your college to benefit from your estate, you need to write that down. You just can't hope somebody does it. And so, well, everybody knew I wanted, X property to go to Davis. it needs to be in writing. And if it's not enforceable. So wills have to be written down. Now, luckily, you can have a holographic will, which is not as cool as it sounds, but it's handwritten and it has to be signed. Some states say has to be dated. That is one way to get around the witness requirement of a typed up will. Because if you have a typed will, you then enter the requirements for there has to be witnesses. And that thus raises the specter of what does your state say about a contemporaneous witness? Is it someone who watches you sign it? Do they have to be in the room with you or not? So Maarva does not seem, people seem to know her wishes. If you know that you're going to end up as a brick, the fact that they want to do the viewing on Rix Road, all of that hints towards a basic estate plan. And if she is we don't know what it means to be a past president of Ferrix, but if she is a past head of state or a mayor, there's generally plans for that. And that could be, it might be an incomplete will, but it could still be part of her intent for what's supposed to happen after she passes.
Yeah.
Like in Star Wars, you could have a holographic will.
Yeah, literally.
B just projects it. He's like, here we go. Here's all her wishes.
I don't know if those would be valid under our laws, even if it is a video recording or a holographic recording of someone saying, I want all of my property go to person X, and I'm of sound mind. I can remember, minute to minute. Is that good enough?
Mm-hmm.
Now there are darker stories. So there was a Coast Guard ship lost on the Great Lakes in a storm, and ship sank. Guys in the engine room survived the sinking. They painted their wills on the bulkheads, waiting for the air to run out. So again, there are those type of horror stories, but again, that would be a valid will. Anywho,
one question that jumped to mind that's really central here is, what about Cassian? Cassian's not a natural born child of Maarva. He's an adoptive child. And how does the law treat that in those scenarios? And, fortunately for Cassian, the answer is, generally speaking, I will assume that Maarva sort of formally adopted Cassian. We'll just assume that. But they're treated as natural born children. So the same, if you, and this goes even if in I think just about every state, maybe I think it's 44 out of 50 states account for adoptive children, even if they're not named in the will. So say Maarva had drafted her will, she's happy with it, and then stumbled upon Cassian and took him under her wing and adopted him, but never changed her will again. In just about every state, he as an adopted child would be provided for under the will. So if she said, hey, all my stuff goes to my children, the law would automatically read him in as one of those children, even if Cassian Andor isn't named anywhere in the will. And if she didn't have the will, he's also in pretty good shape most places in the US because he's treated in that same class of individuals. So intestate succession often looks at sort of classes of relatives, and classically, if you don't have a surviving spouse, which is the case here with Maarva, those natural or the children of the decedent, of the deceased person, are going to be next in line. And so Cassian, generally speaking, would be taken care of under those default rules. For Maarva's sake, this is a good example, a classic case in that Star Wars can use us to teach us. Write a will down. Make a will. You don't want to leave all these open questions. You don't want to leave Cassian having to fight for B, and poor B, like, who do I go to? I want to be with Cass. And meanwhile, the Empire is deciding where your stuff goes. That's not a situation you want to be in.
Right. I had a similar concern as Thomas with respect to a worst case scenario where Maarva didn't leave a will. There was no formal adoption, and so it's unclear with what would happen with the intestacy. And so I don't know the parameters of this for other states, but California does recognize the doctrine of equitable adoption, which is basically a doctrine that allows a person who was accepted and treated as the natural or adopted child, and usually as to whom adoption was promised or contemplated but never performed, to share in the inheritance. The California Supreme Court has said you have to prove that by clear and convincing evidence of intent to adopt, but that can be done in different ways. So it could be by proof of an unperformed or express agreement or promise to adopt, but it could also be something like the decedent's statement of his or her intent to adopt, or the representation to the community at large that the claimant, in this case, Cassian, was the decedent's legally adopted child. And so there could be other avenues to avoid the result of B, just a sheeting to the state, which could be Ferrix, but in the worst case scenario, could also be the Empire, which would be disastrous for B, probably because the Empire wouldn't treat him very well, but also because B contains a lot of information that could be very damaging to the people of Ferrix.
That's fascinating, because it sounds like we have Marvin adoptions in California. And that's just fascinating. For those who aren't Californians, we don't have common law marriage here. So some states do, like you live together for 7 years, you could be viewed as husband and wife just by living together that long. We don't have that, but we do have Marvin v. Marvin, which was in the late 70s. It was the basis of the Saturday Night Live skit, Jane, You Ignorant Slut, with Marvin Gaye having his divorce from a woman he wasn't married to. And the law recognized that they had a contract. She changed her name. They lived as husband and wife. And it established you could have a contractual relationship for something similar to marriage, as long as the consideration is not sex. Like that can't be the consideration for the contract. And so we can have Marvin marriages, and it sounds like a Marvin adoption if you were performing all the things that look like you've adopted someone. I find that fascinating.
Just for the record, Josh, because you have such a magnificent Star Wars and other sci-fi collection of things, everyone on this call has witnessed you have equitably adopted me. So in the untimely event of your demise, as your son, I'll gladly accept all that stuff.
Yeah, but that would cut you off from your biological family. So that's the downside.
Well, look,
they don't have any stuff.
Do my parents have a sweet lightsaber collection? I don't think so. Choices have to be made.
Right. I thank you. I did just get the Kenobi, and yeah, it is glorious. And
see, you're making the case for me. This is
Thomas, if you throw me an extra lightsaber, I'll witness.
Bethany's my sister. Yeah, Bethany's my sister, so
and witness.
All in the family.
No conflicts there.
This is all very Star Wars, all these like reveals of family relationships. It's
the Legal Geeks twist at the end of the season.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So well, it's a big found family. So Jordan's with us. And Jordan, glad you're here, buddy.
Hey, everybody. Sorry I'm late.
It's okay. It's okay. We are going to talk about Luthen's Great Escape. And whoever came up with that idea of the Great Escape, well done.
Thank you.
Was that you?
That was me.
Why don't you take it away, man? All
Nice.
you. Take it away.
So I was going through this, figuring out topics for it, and this seemed like a ripe one of what exactly does Luthen rack up crime-wise in his dealings with the Imperial cruiser, which I keep wanting to call an interdictor cruiser, but isn't. Somebody here knows the name of that ship. Thomas?
Which one? The actual the interdictor cruiser has the hyperspace wells.
No. The one that jams Luthen's comms
Oh,
and tractor beams them.
It's an arrestor cruiser. I can't well.
Thank you. That's right. So with
That's what I'm here
Luthen's
for.
interaction with the arrestor cruiser, first of all, I think it needs to be the question needs to be asked of, is it a valid detention for the arrestor cruiser to jam Luthen's comms and lock him in a tractor beam just because he's kind of hanging out in this area of space? And I'm gonna go no. I'm not a naval law expert, but it seems like just because you're hanging out in an area where they've seen some piracy happen doesn't give them carte blanche to say, who are you? What are you doing here? By the way, we're going to tractor beam you while you answer the question. Certainly in the more civilian world, just because you're in a high crime area doesn't mean the police get to pull you over or stop you and demand your identification if you're just driving through. So no, I don't think they have a particularly valid reason to detain him. Especially not once his code clears. Now, interestingly, we know the code is a humongous lie, but they don't seem to. It is a crime to use someone else's identification. So while we're on the subject of the code, we can tack that one on there. I assume it's some kind of FAA violation to falsify your transponder codes. I don't know that for sure, but I'm willing to make that assumption. Josh, do you know the answer to that?
I don't remember the code section, but I would bet money the FAR does not allow you to use somebody else's transponder. I soloed when I was in high school. It's been a while.
That's still more recently than me, so. So that's Luthen's first real crime here, is he falsifies his transponder codes. Then he starts racking them up real quick. The faked accident to his thruster isn't anything really bad, but then he starts like shooting at them, which, as an aside, is a genius way to get out of a tractor beam that I can't believe no one else in Star Wars has thought of. Oh, they're pulling on us. Let's throw stuff at them.
The dish that projects it being right on the front there seems like a pretty major design flaw to me, but Star Wars has those kind of routinely.
Again, no railings in the entire original series or original trilogy. So damaging the Imperial cruiser, he starts racking up some stuff there. Then they launch TIE fighters at him, and he blows them up. So you got to figure, in addition to the property damage, you tack on the murder of the TIE fighter pilots to that. And then fleeing the stop, because they definitely don't have, I guess this is two parts. One, they don't have a legal justification to stop them. You still can't run. You can't flee and evade an illegal stop. You just get to fight about it later. In court, legally fight about it. Don't actually physically fight with people. So even if they don't have a justification to stop him originally, fleeing the stop gives them all the justification they're ever going to need. It's also an additional crime.
You're telling me that if I want to use my lasers installed on my driver and passenger side door, I can't just do that.
Yeah.
I got to have a word with the people who installed it. I was assured that I could use them in any scenario.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to return the alligators in the moat I have to the people that told me that was, throwback to earlier.
My bad decisions. Sorry, Dad. I'm making bad decisions here. They're being revealed. There's an interesting intersection here with naval law and sort of the law of the sea, if you will, because the business of interdicting vessels, so stopping vessels, like all of Star Wars starts with a naval interdiction above Tatooine, and it gets complicated because the big question is, where are you being interdicted? In our world, there are coastlines, and depending on what coastline you're off of and what distance you are from shore, there are various either domestic or international laws that govern what rules are in effect, how far out from shore that coastal nation can enforce its laws and do certain things. Classically, most people have heard of sort of the high seas. That has a legal context to it, right? That's beyond the territorial jurisdiction of any coastal nation. And coincidentally, it's statistically where most pirate attacks happen. But as you get closer into shore, the coastal nations' laws or their ability to do things, stop vessels, conduct searches, all sorts of things, it gets stronger and stronger until you're in territorial waters within a few miles off of the coastline, and that's where it's classically the strongest. That's where it, effectively you might as well be on, we'll say, U.S. soil in the case of our country. For those purposes, here it's a little difficult to you have to do a little bootstrapping because we're talking about orbit of a planet. The law of the sea hasn't yet been extended out to outer space quite yet, but the planet we're on is not sort of a classically like imperial one, right? We're not dealing with Coruscant. It's Segra Milo. We have no history on this planet. It's not popped up in Star Wars, at least canon to my knowledge. Seems like a pretty remote place, and Saw Gerrera picked it to house his partisan forces. But we'll say, just for purposes of the argument, that this is an imperial planet, albeit one that's like really remote. Well, the Empire, if we're using real world laws and sort of authorities, would have jurisdiction to enforce laws within a certain range of orbit around the planet. And that goes for things like national defense. So the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, has authority under a potentially really, really broad authority in certain circumstances under 50 United States Code, Section 191, which during times of war, or like by presidential declaration, effectively, the president can widely expand the Coast Guard's authority to enforce laws off of our coast. That includes directing the movement, the anchorage of vessels. So basically controlling, a police officer can do a little bit to stop you and whatnot on shore, but the Coast Guard can actually direct your movement. And as if Section 191 is activated within U.S. territorial waters, they can stop you. There's not the same level of sort of evidentiary requirement that law enforcement on land has. And so here the tie-in is that the captain of the arrestor cruiser announces that there's been pirate activity or rebel activity, I can't remember which, in the area. So there's criminal activity. This cruiser has presumably been dispatched there for law enforcement purposes. And especially if it's the case of sort of rebel or insurgent activity, and even in some cases pirate activity, there's now sort of this national security hook. And if you look at section 191, it reads a lot like something that might be read on the Senate floor in Coruscant, like amongst the floating pods there, because it talks in terms of insurrection and these broad sort of emergency powers, if you will, that can be granted. So in this case, I think that if we're applying that law, that arrestor cruiser had the right under the law of the sea to stop the cruiser. The moment the transponder is important, because in our world we have flagged vessels. You could be a vessel flagged to the United States or whatever country. It gives them pause that he announces that he's from Alderaan, so another core planet. That can affect the applicability of certain laws. Effectively, that's like it's not even the same as like a police officer in the United States is not prevented from stopping you in Arizona because you have a Pennsylvania tag, but having a different flag on your vessel, or in this case, an Alderaanian transponder, air quotes, can affect the scope of law that can be applied to you. So it gives them pause, but I think the captain suspects that something is afoot as Luthen is doing all this juggling to keep them delayed. And I love the line, like, we'll just have it for practice, like keep the boarding crew ready. We'll give them the practice. So whether the actual pull in and interdiction was lawful after the stop, I think depends a lot on what laws are in place at this point. We don't know the extent of the emergency action that the Emperor put into place in episode 2 or 3, whatever it was, after the raid. I think it's safe to say that he probably baked within that package of emergency amendments, expanded the Imperial Navy's ability to interdict and seize vessels. So I do think that they had authority there. Luthen was just well prepared. The quote from K2 and Rogue One, like, well, you're a rebel now, that just very much applies to this.
So a couple other off the cuff ideas. Does Luthen have a duty to rescue Krieger and his men? Is there a special relationship between them, or is it okay just to send them to be cannon fodder in order to maintain the deep cover that they have in the ISB? Anyone want to take that?
I'll take a crack at it. So the interesting thing about journalism and intelligence is that you need to maintain the confidence of your sources, and you need to protect your sources because typically they are at varying levels of risk. A recent example of protection of sources or of allies in what's considered to be enemy territory, more simply put, would be a lot of the visa applications that the US is doing for Afghan nationals that helped the US and our allies during OIF and OEF. So you don't really want to do what Luthen's doing, because even though Luthen is protecting an incredibly valuable source, you could also see Krieger and his men as people or sources that need to be protected. Some of those people might also have covers. Some of those people might also have their own sources too that could be lost. So from a purely cynical perspective, I understand what Luthen is doing. But then also from a military leadership perspective, you immediately see some of the fallout to that approach in leadership. So even setting Krieger and all of those people to the side, look at Saw's reaction to what Luthen is doing. And that is the kind of reaction that you're going to get from people who learn that that's essentially what you're willing to do or sacrifice. And so that's just kind of, it's really morally on thin ice, if not just not moral.
I would take it as the opportunity to go, let's hit Ferrix instead. Now you'd have to just redirect the force and go, we need to go do this because they won't expect it. And then we'll go back and hit, the other shipyard later with when they're not expecting it as well. So there's they could go, so the Imperials could at least think, hey, there was a connection. They went after Ferrix instead because of Maarva's death. It creates an opportunity for another action to take place. And then when Stelsgaard or what's the name of the shipyard that's at play?
Spellhouse.
Thomas, do you remember? Anyone remember?
Steven's got it.
Spellhouse.
Yeah.
It's spelled with German too. It's Spellhaus, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I was like, this, I took German in high school. So it's like, this looks familiar. So,
Yeah.
but that way they could at least, give the pretext of save people, still carry out mission objectives. So the ISB could go like, oh, they hit it later after hitting Ferrix. And, so they could plausibly come up with, we weren't compromised. They hit another target because of this funeral that was planned, just as we had planned to launch an operation during the funeral procession as well. So they could, at least come up with that.
Do we know the extent to
Yeah.
which Luthen is planning the Spellhouse operation? Because it seemed to me like Krieger was kind of doing it, and Luthen was just trying to get Saw to help him. Because ordinarily there's not a duty to rescue anyone unless you put someone in a position of imminent injury. So I'm not sure if that plays into the analysis at all.
And I remember getting the feeling that Krieger didn't necessarily want Saw's help. That Luthen was just trying to do this to bring everybody together.
Yeah, Luthen is trying to play a bigger coordinating role. He's not really the planner of the operations. He's the person that's trying to lead, convince, cajole, inspire / blackmail people into cooperating and working with each other for this mission. And so that's kind of where I'm evaluating his actions more from a leadership perspective and a spycraft perspective in that way, because a lot of military folks say mission first, people always, and people argue about the implications of what that is, whether it's great, whether it's terrible. But the basic idea behind that is that you have to accomplish your mission, but without taking care of your people always, then you won't be able to accomplish any missions now or in the future. And so what Luthen is doing, I think, is not finding a creative way to figure out how to save Krieger with, like Josh was talking about, without sacrificing having someone on the inside for the ISB. And the funeral is a perfect opportunity to do that. But there are probably multiple other ways to do that, which is get Krieger to get arrested, like get some of these people to run into some issues or plan the op earlier. So I know it's kind of a hindsight almost looking at the show's plot in this way, but I think it's kind of a cop out for Luthen to just be like, well, this or that, and I'm just going to let 50 people die.
Plus Krieger. Yeah. So
Yeah. Plus Krieger. Yeah.
Plus Krieger.
I-
Yeah.
Is it 50 or 30?
It was
30.
30, but he told Lonnie, the ISB informant, 50. So I would try coming up with another plan that maintains operational security. And it's just bad for recruiting when you purposely get people killed. So it's one thing to send people off to a dangerous mission that has high fatalities. It's another thing to use them as cannon fodder for a distraction.
Yep.
I wonder how much of Luthen's decision making is motivated off of wanting to throw them off the trail of this Axis person, him,
I
because of
don't,
what he tells Saw. Like, if we let them do this, they will do this, being intercept and kill Krieger and his men. They'll think they're invincible and they won't worry about anything else.
I mean, I get the idea of, preserving the contacts that he has in the ISB by sacrificing, pieces on the chessboard. But that's a lot of pieces on the chessboard to sacrifice for a rook or a knight. And
Yeah.
it's like, it's a lot of people to lose, which then makes recruiting harder. Big picture as well.
And to
When you're
Jordan's
making-
point,
Oh,
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna joke that when you cause Saw Gerrera of all people to raise his eyebrow over total number of casualties, you're hitting a nerve.
Yeah,
And
Point
to
taught
Jordan's
us.
point, like if you're in Saw's shoes, if you're in anyone's shoes and you know that happened, you are likely to tell other people that could happen too. Like you're like Saw is wondering, could this happen to me? Could this happen to my people? You would have to start questioning Luthen's intentions. Like I think the character within the show truly is wanting the greater good for the rebellion and wants to see the Empire fall. But if Luthen were a real person in real life that I'd spoken to and I was in Saw's shoes, I would 100% wonder about his motives at this point. Like how much of this is to save his own skin?
Part of the mystique of all Star Wars stories is it's beyond the hero's journey narrative, but it's somebody recognizes an extreme wrong that's about to happen and they take the step to stop the wrong from happening. It dates back to Han Solo going back at the Battle of Yavin and saving Luke, so Luke can take the shot. Or Mandalorian Din Djarin realizing, I'm not leaving the kid with the Empire, and he goes in and rescues the kid. There's always that moment in any Star Wars story. We haven't seen that moment here. And I wonder if we're about to, that Luthen doesn't want all of those people to get killed, and he's coming up with a plan B, which is why his call with his associate, highly coded, she's talking him out of doing something. And is it saving Krieger and company? Because I think it would be silly for him to go back to Ferrix, because that's just asking for trouble.
I read that as going to Ferrix to look for Andor.
Yeah, so did I.
Okay.
Same.
Well, I was the only one in the camp of not Ferrix, but we'll see how that goes.
Well, there were other choices, but I think after he's gotten himself into that dogfight, he's now changed the risk calculus for himself. Even though he might not have had any good choices in that situation, getting tractored in and boarded is probably not a good choice for him either. But now if he does go to Ferrix like he wanted to, he's going to get recognized right away. There's no hiding the Fondor anymore.
No, which is why I would think he wouldn't want to do that, because he's going to need a new contingency plan. And he seems to be the type of guy who would have contingency plans for, if I'm discovered, I'm now going here and this is the new base of operation.
Yeah.
And that ship's probably going to be lost in hyperspace pretty soon.
Yeah.
Oh, the poor navigation droid. He's so helpful.
He
Well,
might
they could
be able
take
to-
him out.
He might be plug and play, just like,
Yeah.
like a big USB drive. He just does a little twist and pulls out the droid and pops him into the next ship that's patiently waiting for him to show up when things get real. Now there's been other speculation with people going like, well, we never see Luthen in anything else. We didn't see Mon Mothma in anything else. You know, where was she during the Battle of Yavin? I'm gonna go with they moved her to a new location. It's a big galaxy and they're at war. He could be someplace else, gearing up, doing what needs to be done. So I don't.
Yeah.
Granted, I do agree with don't get too attached to anyone, because we know how a lot of these people meet their end. But yeah, it's I wouldn't be surprised if he makes it out and does something else for the rebellion.
Yeah.
So anything, what do you do when your teenage daughter wants to get married in a cultish type chant? Do you say no? Or do you go, you know what? I do need that 400 grand in order to balance the ledger so I don't get hung.
Boy, have I got the guy for you.
It's like, what such an ugly choice. Because if I had a teenage daughter who was having friends over doing a religious chant that was, oh, I don't know, something that Aleister Crowley wrote, I would not be okay. Like I would, none of this braid crap. Like, no, like you're not getting married at age 15, but that's me. Anyone else want to tag in on what do you do when your kid's showing cultish behavior and wants to get married?
I just to add that Chandrila has always been sort of this very noble planet. And it's interesting the show is making it seem like it has kind of some darkness to it that is hasn't been represented before.
Yeah, a lot of cultures do have weird traditions. This is not one that's not okay. And I don't know if it goes to the fact that only 2 states in our union prohibit child marriages. So maybe that's the message they're trying to send of, if it's uncomfortable, call your state legislatures. But I dare to dream. Any other topics anyone wants to address?
I mean, Thomas touched on it briefly, but I did want to go back to naval law and how it's like the distances are determined, like what would be international law or the high seas or a country's like territorial waters or close to countries' territorial waters. So like the space domain is considered to be 100 kilometers up from sea level. And you see the Empire acting more and more fascistic, definitely, but also more like a police state version of fascism as well, because the military is taking on so many police-like roles, which is extremely concerning. You would really only see that if martial law is enacted. So Thomas's like reference of that, the emergency packages and the things that keep getting passed in the Senate, or the decisions that the, executive branch, if you will, of the Empire, which is just Palpatine, I guess, keeps making, is you see these showing up in what happens to Cassian, why he winds up in prison, how his trial is handled, how he gets arrested, how he's treated in prison. But I also think you see it in the interaction with Luthen and the Imperial officers, because you have essentially the Imperial Navy stopping someone, his code checks out, they still decide to board anyway for practice. Can you imagine just like driving down the street and a tank rolls up and it's like, we're gonna practice like stopping you and searching your vehicle. So it seems pretty standard at this point in the show, but it was jarring to me to watch because I just can't imagine, like, for example, us in the United States having the entire branches of forces acting as like soldier police, essentially sailor police, that kind of thing. So that was definitely on my mind.
You would be shocked and saddened to see some of the justifications I have seen for police stopping people that
Oh yeah, definitely. Like, I'm not saying that that civilian law enforcement is like exempt from these rules as well. I just think there's an added level of risk to freedom to have the military involved, because by and large the military's job is to kill people and take things or keep things,
fair
if
point.
you will.
So funny thing about our Navy, when they're out doing drug interdiction missions, they're actually under Coast Guard command. So it's this fun little legal loophole that they do, that they have a Coast Guard contingent on board. And if they're going to do a drug stop, that the Coast Guard flag runs up on the destroyer or the aircraft carrier. And for that portion of the mission, the Coast Guard's then in command. And then when the mission's done, the Coast Guard flag comes down and it's not under Coast Guard command anymore, because posse comitatus, we don't want the military outright doing law enforcement. And the Coast Guard's, the branch of the military that does law enforcement and humanitarian missions. So like they get this hybrid mission that's different from the other services. So the more you know.
So is it like there's a whole other captain on there that's a Coast Guard captain?
Yeah, or I don't know if it's a full-blown captain, but whoever's in charge of the Coast Guard contingent. And so that way the ship's under Coast Guard command for that portion of the mission.
Huh.
Yeah, it's fun little things that we have. And yeah, so.
Yeah. Well, and military equipment can be used in support of law enforcement missions too, or even humanitarian missions. That's like when you see the Guard called out for hurricane relief, for example, or the Guard and Reserves using remotely piloted aircraft to help do overwatch of fires in California. That's a good local example. So it's not like there can't be that support, but it's the whole, like, you really don't want to have a military chain of command because they're trained very differently than law enforcement is different than the business of war, basically.
Yeah, it raises the issue of peacekeepers versus peacemakers. And
yeah,
not always mutually they go well together. Sometimes they really don't. However, I think that covers everything this episode. And then we're off to the finale, which I am excited for. This has been, I think, the first truly Emmy-worthy Star Wars show that we've had. The writing's a step above everything else. And we'll see how it ends. It's also the last episode before Thanksgiving. So I wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. I will be presenting at Ferrix, San Francisco, Black Friday. So I'll be on a Nerd Night panel talking Law of the Mandalorian. And then we'll do a Lawyer's Holiday special with Nari Ely and Angela Story. So you will be visited by 3 lawyers. And it should be a rip-roaring good time. So everyone, wherever you listen, please leave a review. I want to thank our patron, Astro Kangaroo. Others can join as well, where I do put early content there. And everyone, regardless, stay safe, stay healthy.